Good evening, everybody. Sorry about the rocky start here. And as Tim said, the topic for tonight is entitled "Just Say No to Useless Maintenance." This is an adaptation of a presentation that I did up at AirVenture this year, and we're going to be talking about how to cut down the amount of maintenance that we need to do on our aircraft by saying no to work that doesn't need to be done and parts that don't need to be replaced. This is something that my company spends a lot of time doing for our clients, and I just want to explain to you what our philosophy is and kind of how it all works. Okay, now my first problem is doesn't seem to want to advance to the next slide. Well, I wonder why not. That's not good. Okay, well, it advanced. So let's see how this works. At any rate, I'm going to sort of focus
good, Mike.
this.
Excuse me, but that did advance into Alan's story, so we got slide 2 now.
Yes, I see that. I have to figure out the buttonology here on this computer. It's a little different than what I'm used to. Anyway, we're going to focus the presentation tonight against an actual real-life story of an aircraft owner who actually didn't start out being one of my clients, but sort of became one of my clients in an extreme situation that he ran into, and we'll use it as a kind of a case study to try to illustrate the points about what sort of maintenance we want to be doing and what sort of maintenance we want to be saying no to. But basically, Alan is a businessman. He bought a new Cirrus SR-22 in 2003. He flies the airplane a great deal, 250 to 300 hours a year. Basically, he commutes to work in it and flies it almost every day. He bought it new, and after the warranty expired and all of the maintenance started being on his nickel, he wound up finding himself spending on the order of $5,000 or $6,000 a year on his annual inspections on this airplane. It's a pretty sophisticated airplane, and that's not out of line. Uh-oh, I guess I forgot to mute this. Sorry about that. Any rate, in 2010, when his airplane was, and he had the airplane for 7 years, he'd accumulated about 1,866 hours on the airplane. And then he did something that he wound up regretting. He decided to try a different service center than the one that he had been using since he bought the airplane. As it happens, he didn't do a lot of due diligence on this new service center, but he dropped the airplane off for its annual inspection and then proceeded to get on a 747 and fly to India on a 2-week business trip. Well, it turned out to be a pretty big mistake, because about a week into his 2-week business trip, he picked up his email while he was in Mumbai, India, and found an email from the service center indicating that they had inspected his airplane, and they had found 89 discrepancies, and they presented him with a detailed discrepancy list and a repair estimate that totaled nearly $25,000. Which obviously didn't amuse Alan very much at all. In fact, he was staggered, he was panicked, and the next thing he did was send me an email. You can imagine what his reaction would have been. So I had him send me the estimate, and I started going through it in detail. This was a very long estimate. As I said, there were 89 items on the discrepancy list, And let me just very quickly run through them for you. I won't spend a lot of time on this, just to give you an idea, because a $25,000 estimate for an annual inspection is pretty mind-boggling. The estimate started out with a flat rate charge for the annual inspection. The flat rate was $3,645, which in my experience, and my company manages about 8% of all the Cirruses in the United States, so we have a lot of experience doing Cirrus annuals. And $3,600 for a flat rate on a Cirrus SR22 annual is more than 50% more than what it really should be. An annual inspection on that airplane should be about 24, 25 hours of labor. So at an $80 or $90 shop rate, it should be just a little bit north of $2,000. This shop charged by far the highest flat rate I'd ever heard of, but since Alan had already agreed to it, there wasn't much we were going to be able to do about that. And then we start through the discrepancy list. 5-year flex hose replacement, $1,900. 5-year fuel drain valve seals, $180. Gascolator drain seals, $150. 5-year aileron rudder shock cord replacement, $160. Alternator number 1, 500-hour exchange, $1,440. 1,700-hour alternator 2 overhaul, $790. The prop has a recommended TBO of 6 years or 1,800 hours. The prop was 7 years old, hadn't been overhauled, so the shop wanted to overhaul the prop for $3,720. 4-year overhaul of magnetos, $1,700. Battery main battery replacement, a 2-year item, $700. Replacement of the anti-ice filter and the TKS anti-icing system, a 2-year item, $320. Fuel injector cleaning, the propeller TKS boots were found to be cracking, and they wanted to replace those for $860. Some heat damage on the lower cowling. They estimated the repair on that to be $940. Wing root fairing caps disbonding, a problem that we see on SR-22s fairly often because Cirrus, in their infinite wisdom, attached them with 2-sided tape. $950 for that. The muffler flame cones were warped. They wanted to replace both mufflers for $2,280. The ELT was still an old 121.5 ELT, and they wanted to upgrade it to a 406 megahertz ELT for $750. Some miscellaneous cosmetic things, paint touch-up and so on, $1,620. And about 50 additional minor squawks that I won't go through with you, totaling about $1,400. And so if you add all of that stuff up, you get very, very close to $25,000. Now, when I took a look at this, here's my first observation. I backed up and squinted real hard and looked at this 89 discrepancy squawk list and observed that the vast majority of the items on this squawk list were not really discrepancies. There was nothing wrong with most of the items that were written up. The majority of them were recommended replacements on a time-directed basis. 5-year this, 500-hour that, 6-year, 4-year, 2-year, something else. But there wasn't anything wrong with the hoses or the gascolator seals or the aileron rudder shock cord or either of the alternators or the propeller. All those things were working just fine. It's just that in the manufacturer's maintenance manual, there were recommendations to replace or overhaul those things at specific time intervals. And that represented the lion's share of this $25,000 estimate. There were also a couple of things like, replacing the ELT with a 406 megahertz ELT. That again, there was nothing wrong with the existing ELT. It just wasn't up to date. So it wasn't any sort of a compulsory item. But when you looked at this estimate, really only a very small part of it were actual discrepancies that were discovered during the inspection. You know, things like the ice boots cracking, or the cowl damage, or the wing roof fairings disbonding, or the muffler cones, flame cones warped. Those were actual discrepancies. Those were actual things that the shop found wrong. But the vast majority of these 89 items were not real discrepancies. They were just recommended preventive maintenance items. So it's important to kind of put all this stuff in perspective that way. And as I said, a big batch of them, and a very substantial part of this whole thing, were a list of time-directed items. So what did we recommend that Alan do? Well, we recommended that he say no to a lot of this stuff. It's important to understand, and our perspective on maintenance is that maintenance is not an inherently good thing. It's not something we want to do. It's really more like a necessary evil. I think of maintenance, and I've said this before in other webinars, I think of aircraft maintenance the way I think about surgery. Sometimes we have to do it, but we don't want to do more than necessary, and we certainly don't get extra credit for doing more maintenance than the airplane really requires. In my view, more maintenance is not better maintenance. Usually more maintenance is worse, both because it's expensive and because every time mechanics take something apart on an airplane, you run the risk that they will put it back together wrong, or they'll do something that breaks the airplane. And every aircraft owner has had that experience of putting their aircraft in the shop, you know, whether it's for an oil change or an annual inspection or something, and getting the aircraft back after maintenance and discovering that something that was working perfectly fine before the airplane went into the shop isn't working fine now. And that happens constantly. And so the less we let mechanics take things apart and put them back together, the less likely it is they're going to break things. Now, that's not to say we can eliminate all maintenance. Obviously, we can't. But we shouldn't allow maintenance to be done unless there's a good reason for it. By the way, that little picture there of that crankcase with a big hole in the side of it, that happens to be a case where the airplane went into the shop and the owner got talked into doing a top overhaul, pulling all the cylinders and replacing them. And a few hours after the airplane came out of that maintenance, it threw a rod through the side of the case and had a catastrophic engine failure, and the airplane fell out of the sky. Fortunately, the owner did a real nice job of putting it on the ground, and nobody was hurt or killed, but it was a pretty expensive experience. And as is usually the case, the top overhaul really wasn't warranted. There was no reason to be doing it, and the fact that the mechanic failed to torque some things quite right caused this catastrophic failure. We see this sort of thing a lot more than you'd really like to see. Maintenance-induced failure is pretty common. These manufacturers' maintenance recommendations, and you could see a whole bunch of them in Alan's discrepancy list, are usually just recommendations, not requirements. For the most part, anytime a manufacturer says, suggests changing something every 500 hours or 2 years or whatever that is, whether it's stated as a TBO or a recommended replacement interval or stuff, almost all of those are simply manufacturer's recommendations, and they aren't required by regulation, at least for Part 91 operators. So they're all things that we can say no to if we don't want to do them. In my experience, the manufacturer's recommendations are frequently excessive, quite costly, sometimes even detrimental. For example, you may have noticed that they recommend cleaning the fuel injectors every year. Well, we have a lot of data showing that cleaning fuel injectors on a prophylactic basis is much more likely to create a problem than it is to solve a problem, because fuel injectors are pretty much self-cleaning. They've got a very effective solvent running through them all the time. And we can easily tell when a fuel injector needs to be cleaned simply by looking at the engine monitor data. And if we see that one cylinder is starting to run leaner than the others, then sure, we'll have that injector cleaned. But to do it on an annual basis, cleaning all the injectors prophylactically, is not only a waste of money, but it's very likely to create a problem because every time you take the fuel system apart, you run the risk of allowing contaminants to get in. And the vast majority of clogged fuel injectors are caused by mechanics, not cured by mechanics. So and lots of stuff is like that. Now, as aircraft owners, it's your job to say no to this sort of thing. And when I say this sort of thing, I mean recommended maintenance items that don't clearly contribute to the safety or dispatch reliability of the aircraft. I mean, we don't do maintenance for maintenance's sake. There are only two reasons, or actually three reasons to do maintenance. One is that it is something required to keep the airplane safe. The second is that it's required to keep the airplane reliable. That is, that it will work when we want it to work and it won't leave us stranded somewhere. And the third is that it's required by regulation. And there are certain maintenance items that are required by regulation and that we have to do. I mean, for example, complying with ADs. But any maintenance task that doesn't meet at least one of those three criteria, that is, it demonstrably contributes to safety or to dispatch reliability, or it's required by regulation. If it doesn't meet at least one of those criteria, then we ought to say no to it. And the thing that you need to understand is that mechanics will always do maintenance on your aircraft by the book, following all the manufacturer's recommendations, unless you instruct them otherwise and do so in writing. Because if they take it upon themselves not to maintain the airplane in accordance with manufacturer's recommendations, and then something goes wrong, they're going to look pretty silly on the witness stand or in deposition when a lawsuit is brought against them. And frankly, these days, mechanics are terrified of lawsuits, and rightly so. Since 1994, when Congress passed the General Aviation Revitalization Act, which was the law that put an 18-year statute of repose on product liability for aircraft manufacturers, since it's has become a lot harder to sue the aircraft manufacturer when an airplane crashes or somebody gets hurt. Everybody else involved in aircraft are getting sued much more frequently than they used to be. It used to be that nobody sued shops or mechanics because they didn't have a lot of money and they weren't worth going after. You always sued the aircraft manufacturer because they had a deep pocket. But since GERA protects the aircraft manufacturers, shops and mechanics are being sued much more often than they used to be, and they're very paranoid about it. And well, maybe paranoid is not the right word, because they actually are being sued a lot, and they're very concerned about that. Even a groundless lawsuit can be a life-changing event for a mechanic, because even if it's groundless, you have to defend it, and it's very expensive to do that. So in any case, because of concerns about liability, mechanics are always going to follow the manufacturer's recommendations unless the aircraft owner specifically instructs them not to do that and does so in writing. So if you don't want your shop or a mechanic to do things strictly according to the manufacturer's recommendations, and trust me, you don't, Alan's case is a perfect example of that, then you really need to give them clear written instructions as to what you want to do and what you don't want them to do. And those clear written instructions from the owner is what takes the shop off the hook liability-wise, because if it's ever questioned later, the mechanic can say, well, that wasn't my decision, that was the owner's decision. And of course, the owner is the one who should be making these decisions. So you need to be very clear with your shop what you want to approve and what you want to decline, and you need to do it in writing. And if you do that, then you have control over the process instead of leaving the control in the hands of mechanics whose interests are different than yours. His interest is in minimizing his liability. Your interest is in having a safe and reliable airplane on a budget, and those are very different objectives. We encourage owners to be very proactive in keeping control of the maintenance of their aircraft. Of course, the trick is knowing when to say no to maintenance recommendations. So let's talk about that a little bit, and let me tell you a little bit about our philosophy of what we say yes to and what we say no to. The first thing, and I think we've sort of broached on this already, is that we always say no to time-based preventive maintenance that could be performed on condition instead. Time-based maintenance means you do something every so many hours or so many calendar months, that sort of thing. On condition maintenance means you do it when inspection shows that it's necessary. I mean, for example, Cirrus recommended, in Alan's case, that the main ship's battery in the SR-22 be replaced every 2 years. The manufacturer of the battery doesn't recommend that. What they recommend is doing a capacity check every year and replacing the battery only when its capacity has deteriorated to 80% or less of its new specifications. Now, the first way, doing it every 2 years, is time-based. The second way, doing it on condition via a capacity check that's done at each annual inspection, is condition-based. Condition-based maintenance is always much more efficient than time-based maintenance. The only good reason to ever do time-based maintenance is for items where there's no practical way to determine condition. And there are a few things like that on our airplanes. For example, we send mags out for a disassembly inspection every 500 hours because there's no good way for a mechanic to determine the condition of the magneto without removing it from the airplane and taking it all apart. As long as it's mounted on the engine, it's a black box, and the mechanic has no way of assessing its condition. And there are a handful of things on our airplanes that are like that, where we really have to take them apart every, on a periodic basis, in the case of mags every 500 hours, because we don't have an effective way of determining their condition otherwise. But those are very, very rare, and 95% of the components on our airplanes can be readily inspected, and we can maintain them on condition. And that includes things like engines and propellers and so on. Things like engine TBOs and propeller TBOs are excellent candidates for a condition-based approach rather than doing things on a fixed timetable. And I think those of you who have participated in my previous webinars or read some of my articles in Sport Aviation know that the engines on my airplane, both of them, are a little over 200% of TBO right now, and they're doing just fine. And I'm keeping a close eye on them. But I don't really, I'm not a big believer in the concept of fixed TBO. And in fact, I did an entire webinar on that particular subject. Another area where we tend to say no to recommended maintenance is that we say no to maintenance that is intended to prevent failures which are acceptable failures. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Preventive maintenance, obviously, is maintenance intended to prevent things from failing. But not all failures are created equal. And so we need to think a little bit about the consequences of various kinds of failures. If a component fails, could it hurt or kill someone? If so, that's unacceptable, and we absolutely need to do everything we can to prevent that failure. If it fails, could it leave you stranded somewhere? Well, that's not quite as bad as hurting or killing someone. But nobody likes to be stuck in Sheep Dip, Nebraska on on a Saturday when that's really not where you want to be. So it's probably worth spending some money in maintenance to deal with failures that could leave you. For example, the failure of magneto probably won't make you fall out of the sky because you have two of them. But if the magneto is off again until that magneto is changed, and if you wind up in Sheep Dip on a Friday night, it's quite possible you won't be able to get out of Sheep Dip until Tuesday morning. So even though we do have two magnetos, we really don't want to risk having one fail. But the vast majority of failures that we have in aircraft are what I call acceptable failures. That is, they're not going to hurt or kill someone. They're not going to leave you stranded. They're just going to cost you money. I mean, example, if your number 2 comm radio fails, that's an acceptable failure. It's not going to cause you to have an accident, and it's not going to prevent you from getting home. But when you get home, you're going to have to put the radio in the avionics shop and get it fixed. So it just has a money impact. It doesn't have a safety impact or an operational impact. And things like that, really, there's no reason to be spending money to prevent those kinds of failures because the failures are acceptable. So, for example, in a Cirrus, in Alan Cirrus SR-22, he has a quadruply redundant electrical system. It's an all-electric airplane. It's got 2 batteries, and it's got 2 alternators. So the failure of any one of those components is not a big deal. And therefore, trying to prevent those failures by, doing a $1,000 overhaul on the alternator every 500 hours makes no sense. The failure is an acceptable failure. If you want to spend money, maybe buy an extra alternator and carry a spare. But to retire a perfectly good functioning alternator just because it's reached 500 hours doesn't make any sense. So it's the sort of thing that we say no to. The third category of things we say no to are what I would classify as overkill. For example, the shop wanted to replace both of Alan's mufflers because the flame cones were warped. Now, there's no reason to replace those mufflers. We can send them out for repair, and it will cost about half as much as new mufflers would cost. And furthermore, the repaired mufflers are actually more robust than the new ones are. So it doesn't make sense to replace the mufflers when we can repair them. As a general rule, we've sort of got this hierarchy of things we can do when something doesn't work. And they range from the most expensive to the least expensive. We can replace it with a new component. We can have it rebuilt, which means it goes back to the factory. We can have it overhauled, or we can have it repaired. And each of those layers in the pyramid, if you will, costs less than the higher layer. And the trick is to use the lowest one that will get the job done. One of the things I've noticed over the years in maintenance is that so many, both owners and mechanics, are spring-loaded to the overhauled position. When something doesn't work, they always want to overhaul it. And overhauling can be very, very expensive compared to repairing. When you overhaul something, the shop has to basically go through the overhaul manual and replace every component that the overhaul manual calls for being replaced, has to measure every other component and see whether it's within the fits and limits that are specified in the overhaul manual. And so overhauls tend to be very expensive. I mean, for example, if you overhaul a gyro instrument, they always have to replace the bearings, whether the bearings are good or not, because the overhaul manual says to overhaul a gyro, they have to replace the bearings. If you send that same instrument in for a repair, then you give the technician the discretion of checking the bearings and saying, are they good or are they bad? If they're good, he'll leave them alone. If they're bad, he'll replace them. But when you use the O word, you take all the discretion away from the technician, and he has to just, march through the overhaul manual and do everything the overhaul manual says. And if he doesn't, and he uses the word overhaul in his logbook entry, he can lose his certificate. So be careful about using the O word, because it's going to cost you a bunch of money, and you only want to say it when you really mean it. Most of the time, what you want is something to be repaired. Repaired, actually the term of art is IRAN, inspect and repair as necessary, which means just do what needs to be done to make this inoperative component operative again, and then stop. And that's usually what we want to do. So the words you use are very important. I made a passing reference a little earlier to a top overhaul. We almost always say no to top overhaul. Top overhaul means replacing all the cylinders on an engine at once. And normally there's no justification for doing that, because we never have all the cylinders on an engine go bad at once. The typical scenario is the airplane goes into the shop and they do a compression test, and maybe 1 or 2 cylinders are weak, and the mechanic says, well, we could just replace those 2 cylinders, and then we'll probably have to replace another 1 or 2 next year, or we could just bite the bullet and replace them all now. And it's really more efficient to do that because, look, I'm dropping the exhaust and I'm dropping the induction system and taking all the baffles out of the way, and we might as well just do it once. And it's an appealing argument, and owners buy it a lot, and so we see a lot of top overhauls done. But it's a bad idea. The fact that 1 or 2 cylinders show up weak in a compression test at one annual tells you absolutely nothing about what the other cylinders are going to do. Over the last 25 years, I have had to replace 4 cylinders on my 12-cylinder twin. So that, what is that, about 1 cylinder every 5-point-something years. And had somebody said, well, this cylinder is bad, we're going to have to replace it, but you might as well replace the other 5 while we're at it. Can you imagine how much that would have cost me over the years? It's just generally a bad idea, and we almost always say no to top overhauls. When cylinders are bad, we replace them, and if they're not bad, we leave them alone. Now let's talk a little bit about things we don't want to say no to. The first thing we definitely don't want to say no to is anything required by regulation. Because if maintenance is required by regulation, it's non-negotiable. If you say no to something required by regulation, the shop is not going to be able to sign off your annual as airworthy. What kinds of things are required by regulation? Well, obviously airworthiness directives. If you have a newer designed airplane like a Cirrus, there'll be a section of the service manual called airworthiness limitations, and anything in the airworthiness limitations section is required by regulation. For example, on the Cirrus, the parachute, it has a parachute system, and the rocket and the canopy have to be replaced every 10 years, and that's non-negotiable. You have to do it every 10 years. At 10 years and 1 day, that Cirrus becomes a very expensive paperweight. Required by regulation, non-negotiable, got to do it. Very expensive too. It's about 12 grand to do the 10-year refit on the parachute, but it's something that has to be done. They do not allow you to do it on condition. It must be done every 10 years by regulation, so we have no choice. Required inspections that are written right into the regs, Part 43, Appendix D, are things that we have to do. For example, mechanic is required to do a compression check. Or mechanic is required to cut open the oil filter and inspect it for metal. Mechanic is required to do an engine run-up and check all of the key engine parameters. And if you ask him not to do that, he's not going to be able to sign off your annual because those things are required by regulation. Other things that are required by regulation are biennial certs on transponders and altimeters and altitude encoders. The ELT battery replacement, which is done on a particular timetable and not on condition, but it's written right into the regs, so you don't have any choice. Things like that are required by regulation, we can't say no to, because the mechanic has no discretion. His hands are tied. If we say no to any of those things, he is not going to be able to sign off the annual as airworthy. The second thing we usually try not to say no to are airworthiness items, discrepancies that the mechanic has specifically identified as an airworthiness item. Now, airworthiness item is one that the inspecting IA judges to be sufficiently serious that he can't sign off the annual as airworthy unless it's fixed. And anytime we put our airplane in the shop for an annual and ask the shop to give us a discrepancy list, it's really important to make sure that they identify which of those discrepancies are airworthiness items and which aren't. Generally, in my experience, maybe 20% of the discrepancies that are found in an annual tend to be airworthiness items. The rest are discretionary. But it's really important to make sure that the IA documents which of the items he considers to be an airworthiness item. Because if we say no to an item that he considers an airworthiness item, then he's not going to be able to sign off the annual. By identifying that discrepancy as an airworthiness item, he's basically telegraphing to us that he considers this sufficiently important that he doesn't think he's going to be able to sign off the annual as airworthy unless that problem is addressed. Now, the one caveat I would give you on this is that there are some ultra cautious IAs who tend to write up everything as an airworthiness item. And so if the IA writes something up as an airworthiness item that you really don't want to do and you really think that it's not an airworthiness item, then it would be worth your while to get a second opinion from another IA, or drop me an email or something and get another opinion before you just go ahead and approve it. But in any case, if we say no to an item that the IA identifies as an airworthiness item, at the very least we're going to have a very interesting conversation on our hands trying to convince him that he should sign off the annual anyway. So at any rate, those are some basic principles. And let's go back to Alan's situation. We went over the discrepancy list. We did a bunch of horse trading with the shop. Said no to a lot of stuff. Argued back and forth on a few of them. And at the end of the day, the final invoice on Alan's annual was $8,000. Now, that was still kind of high. He was used to his annuals being 5 or 6. And part of that was just baked into the cake when he picked this bad service center who was very overpriced on a lot of stuff. But after working things with the shop, we reduced the cost of his annual from what was originally estimated by about $17,000. And let me just go through the items and show you what we did. And I've sort of given you the basic principles now, and so this stuff should be this stuff hopefully will make sense to you. 5-year flex hose replacement. We said no to that. That was a manufacturer recommendation. We said replace the hoses on condition, not on a fixed timetable. We also ultimately wound up convincing Cirrus to change their maintenance manual. And as of about 6 months ago, the SR-22 maintenance manual no longer calls for hose replacement every 5 years. They call for replacement on condition. So this is a good thing. And a lot of these time-directed things don't make a lot of sense. And because we manage so many Cirrus airplanes and we have a pretty good relationship with the factory, we've had some success in getting them to back off on some of these recommendations. But you have to understand that they are just recommendations, and you can say no to them. 5-year fuel drain valve seals, that's just plain silly. You know, you replace the drain valve seals when the drain valve starts to leak. If there's blue spots on the hangar floor, then you need to replace the seals. If there aren't, you leave it alone. It was just totally silly to do that on a fixed timetable. The same thing with the gasculator seals. The same thing with the aileron rudder shock cord. If something is wrong with the shock cord, the airplane will feel a little funny, but it's not dangerous. It's not going to fall out of the sky. And you take it in and you say, change the shock cord. It's about a 15-minute job. Silly to be doing that on a fixed timetable. You do it on condition. The alternator number 1 replacement every 500 hours for $1,440. I mean, think about that. That adds almost $3 an hour to your cost of flying if you're going to do that. It's ridiculous to do that. This is a highly redundant electrical system. An alternator failure is not a big deal in this airplane because it's got a backup alternator. It's got 2 batteries. But even more significantly, these number 1 alternators have an extremely high infant mortality rate. We sometimes see them fail after 10 hours, 25 hours. If you have an alternator that made it to 500 hours, you got one of the good ones. The last thing you want to do is replace it. So we always say no to that sort of thing. Same thing on the alternator 2 overhaul. Again, we consider it a run-to-failure item. When it fails, you replace it. The prop overhaul, the 6-year overhaul recommendation is recommended in this case by Hartzell. It was a Hartzell prop, because their concern is that airplanes that don't fly very much and sit around might develop corrosion inside the hub. And so for airplanes that are in a high corrosion environment and don't fly very much, I mean, there are some airplanes that fly 25, 30, 40 hours a year, and they would take decades to reach the hour TBO. So that's why Hartzell and Macaulay, for that matter, recommend an overhaul at a calendar time as well as an hour limit, so that the airplanes that fly a lot will hit the hour limit, and the airplanes that are inactive will hit the calendar time limit. Well, that's fine, but we know a lot about this particular airplane. Alan's airplane flies a tremendous amount. It's never idle. It's hangared all the time. He is at extremely low risk of any sort of corrosion problem in that propeller. And tearing that propeller down every 6 years in Alan's case just doesn't make any sense. So, our recommendation is to tear it down at engine TBO, and to ignore the calendar time the calendar time TBO. If the airplane were tied down outside in South Florida, then I think overhauling it at 6 years would make sense. But you need to put these things into context. And one of the problems with manufacturers' TBOs is that they're a one-size-fits-all thing that doesn't take into account how the airplane's flown, where it lives, all of those sorts of things that we should be taking into account. 4-year overhaul of magnetos, the same thing. We first of all, doing anything to magnetos on calendar time makes no sense, because the magnetos don't wear on calendar time, they wear on hours. And second of all, there's no need to overhaul them. We do an IRAN, a teardown inspection. Inspect and repair as necessary every 500 hours. And we give the magneto technician discretion as to what needs replacement and what can be left alone based on the actual condition of the mag. When you overhaul it instead of IRANing it, then you take all of that discretion away from the technician. Not a good idea. Plus, the IRAN is typically about half the price of an overhaul. 2-year main battery replacement makes no sense at all. The battery manufacturer even doesn't recommend that. They recommend doing a capacity check every year and retiring the battery when it flunks the capacity check. And typically they last 3 to 5 years. We've had some airplanes that go 6 or 7 years. But we retire batteries when they have lost 20% of their capacity. We don't retire them on a fixed timetable, and 2 years is way too short for most airplanes. The anti-ice filter is another one. We've never seen a TKS anti-ice filter come out that wasn't spotlessly clean, because the only thing that goes through it is pure TKS fluid. And so we tell the owners, unless you have some reason to believe somebody poured a Diet Coke into your TKS tank, it makes no sense to replace the filter unless your TKS system is giving you trouble. It's an expensive job to replace the filter, $320, and every time a filter comes out, it's always spotless. So it just doesn't make sense. We always say no to that. And again, this is one that recently Cirrus took the 2-year filter replacement out of their manual, but they've had it in there for the better part of a decade, and we just always say no to it. We've already talked about fuel nozzle cleaning. It's never a good idea to clean fuel nozzles prophylactically, because the chances of it causing a problem are greater than the chances of it curing a problem. We know whether a fuel injector needs replacement or needs to be cleaned or not by looking at the engine monitor data. And before each annual inspection, we ask our clients to go fly a flight test profile and dump their engine monitor data, and we take a look at it. And if it looks like one of the cylinders is running lean, we'll suggest cleaning the nozzle. If the cylinders are all running at the same mixture, we'll say leave the nozzles alone. The TKS de-ice boot cracking, we asked the shop to give us a photograph. We looked at the photograph and determined that the cracking was only at the cosmetic stage, and that it hadn't progressed to the point that there was any danger of the TKS de-ice boot starting to disbond from the prop. So we declined it and said we'll keep an eye on it, and if it gets bad enough, then we'll do it. Excuse me. The lower cowling heat damage repair, the same thing. We asked for a photograph, and we were convinced that it was serious damage, so we authorized that repair. Wing root fairing caps, again, we asked for photographs, and we determined that that was worth doing, so we authorized it. The muffler flame cones, I mentioned to you that we asked the shop not to replace the mufflers, but to send them out for repair. Took 2 extra days, and was half the cost. And on the 406 ELT, they wanted to replace it for $1,750. The airplane had an ACK ELT in there, and ACK was about to come out with their 406 version that was a drop-in replacement and would have cost 1/3 as much to replace. So after consulting with the owner, we said, thanks but no thanks. We won't change the ELT out until the EO4 is released, which it was about 6 months later. That was a drop-in replacement with essentially no installation cost. The miscellaneous paint touch-ups, we got some photographs. We emailed them to the owner, said, does this bother you? He said, no. We told him not to do it. And most of the additional minor squawks, most of them we wound up saying yes to. They were small things, and they looked like they needed to be done, so the majority of them we wound up approving. And so the bottom line was that we got the estimate down from $25,000 to about $8,000 by judiciously going through and saying no to the appropriate stuff and saying yes to the stuff that really needed to be done. Now, I do want to point out that Alan's case was unusual. It was quite extreme. We don't see $25,000 annual estimates all that often, and it's not a a common occurrence to be able to cut the cost of an annual by 2/3, but we routinely cut them in half by saying no to stuff using these basic principles that we're talking about. And this is something that every aircraft owner should be doing. For years, I went around teaching seminars to aircraft owners on how to do this, and now I'm doing it in the form of webinars. These principles are something I've been personally using for about 25 years with tremendous success. I am an absolute minimalist in the maintenance of my own airplane, and my airplane is the most reliable airplane that you can imagine. I don't think I've canceled a flight for a mechanical in 2 decades. It's just an incredibly reliable airplane, and I think a big part of the reason it's reliable is because I don't take it apart and put it back together any more than absolutely necessary. In the last 4.5 years, my company has managed a little over 800 annuals using these techniques, and so far we've got a perfect batting average. So this is good stuff to do. And Tim, I think that's about all. I think we have some time for Q&A. So why don't we open it up?
Great. Okay. Yeah, we do have a few questions that have come in, Mike. Let me dive right into them here. And kind of going back to the beginning, talking about liability, there's a question, should you ever be concerned with liability if you decline a service that's in the manufacturer's schedule or the mechanic has recommended? Should we be concerned about accepting the liability that the mechanics are worried about?
Well, that's an excellent question, and let me try to address it, but let me prefix it by saying I'm not a lawyer, and anything I say should not be construed to be legal advice. But I've talked to a lot of lawyers about this, and it really depends on your situation. If your airplane is an owner-flown airplane like mine, and you get into some sort of an accident, you are already at sort of maximum risk in terms of liability by virtue of the fact that you were flying the airplane. And anything that you did with regard to maintenance decisions is almost certainly not going to affect your liability, because your liability is already quite great simply by virtue of the fact that you were the pilot. And of course, the vast majority of such situations are basically settled by the insurance company within insurance limits, and it won't change one way or the other with regard to maintenance decisions. Now, it's a little bit different if, for example, it's a flying club airplane or something like that, where the pilot and the owner are two different people. If you are an owner but not the pilot, then the situation, then your liability might be significantly affected by your maintenance decisions, because you're not you don't have the pilot liability, and the maintenance liability would sort of be a separate component. So it's more common for airplanes that are in flying clubs or that sort of thing, flight school airplanes and that sort of thing, to comply religiously with the manufacturer's recommendations for liability reasons. And I can understand that. I think that's a legitimate concern. But our clientele and the philosophy that I'm discussing here is really one that's intended to apply to the owner-flown aircraft. And I think that for owner-flown aircraft, you really are not affecting your overall liability but by making maintenance decisions of this sort.
Okay, great. And Gary has a question here. He says that What should an owner do when a shop has the plane and then refuses to sign off an annual when you do not agree on the services they want to do?
Well, uh, I can't really address that in full detail uh, during this session because because the discussion is a little bit long. But basically, the procedure is really a three-step procedure that I recommend. The first is to sit down with the IA or the shop owner, explain your position, listen carefully to their position, and see if you can find common ground. If that doesn't work, the second step is to go find an expert in the area in dispute. If it's an engine issue, find an engine expert. If it's a sheet metal repair kind of issue, find a sheet metal expert and get a second opinion. If the second opinion giver, and preferably get a second opinion from somebody who your mechanic will respect as an expert. If the second opinion giver agrees with your mechanic, then be prepared to eat humble pie. If the second opinion giver agrees with you, then ask the second opinion giver to call your mechanic and discuss it, because the mechanic will probably be willing to consider the opinion coming from an expert more readily than he would consider it coming from you as a non-mechanic aircraft owner. And I've done lots and lots of the second opinion stuff in my career, and of course we do it every day when we're dealing with the launch maintenance clients. And we're pretty good at we're pretty persuasive, let's put it that way. If that doesn't work, the last step in the game is to basically fire the IA. And the way you do that in the context of an annual is you simply say, look, we're going to have to agree to disagree on this. I direct you to sign off the annual with discrepancies, which takes the IA off the hook. He signs off your annual, gives you a discrepancy list, and then you go find somebody else who has their head screwed on correctly. It doesn't need to be an IA. It can just be any old mechanic to clear the discrepancy. You never have to deal with that IA again. He doesn't have to reinspect. His job is done the minute you tell him to sign off the annual with discrepancy, and then the airplane is back in your hands. If you need to fly it to another airport to get the discrepancy cleared, then you're going to have to go get a ferry permit. We do that routinely as well. It's usually not a big deal. But basically, if you just can't come to agreement with the IA after talking to him about it and after getting a second opinion, then the final recourse is to fire him, and you do that by directing him to sign off the annual discrepancies, take your airplane back, pay the bill, and then go find somebody else to clear the discrepancy. Out of the 400 annuals a year that we do, we might have to do that maybe on one of them a year. It's not very common to get that far crosswise with an IA, but it, once in a great while we have to do it. So I think that answers the question.
Yes. Okay. Good. Camilla asks if oil changes fall under a time-based maintenance interval.
Well, yeah, oil changes. I mean, we typically recommend doing oil changes on a time-based basis. For airplanes with a full flow oil filter, we generally recommend changing the oil every 50 hours or 4 calendar months, whichever comes first. So if you fly a lot, you'll hit the 50 hours first. If you don't fly 150 hours a year, then you'll typically hit the 4 months first. Now, it's theoretically possible to do oil changes on condition. You could take oil samples and send them to the lab and decide when to change the oil based on what the oil analysis says. But that's probably not really practical to do. The oil analysis is going to cost you $30, and taking the sample is going to cost you something. And so typically, just from a practical standpoint, it usually makes sense to change the oil on a time-directed basis, and that's what we tend to do. Changing batteries, on the other hand, at $600 or $700 a whack, you know, that's real money, and so we don't like to do that on time. We do that on condition.
Okay, John asks, if you flew a single instead of a twin, would you be as comfortable flying an engine at 200% TBO?
Absolutely, absolutely, without question. More than 90% of our clientele fly single-engine airplanes. I don't think we have any clients at 200% of TPO, but I know we've got a number that are beyond 150%. In flight school airplanes, we routinely see, you know, small Lycomings, 320, 360 Lycomings, that typically have 2,000-hour TBOs. We routinely see them go to 4,000 or 5,000 hours without anything being done to them. There's a whole webinar that I did on the subject of TBOs, and I can't go through it right now, but I presented a whole bunch of NTSB data showing that there is absolutely not a shred of evidence to suggest that the risk of a catastrophic engine failure goes up as the engine goes beyond TBO. Clearly, it is very clear from the data that by far the greatest risk of catastrophic engine failure occurs within the first 200 hours after the engine is built, rebuilt, or overhauled. In other words, catastrophic engine failures are usually infant mortality failures. They're not old age failures. And the other time that catastrophic engine failures tend to happen is after major invasive maintenance, like that top overhaul picture that I showed you. So I'm not even slightly concerned from a safety standpoint about running my engines at 200% of TBO. The time I'm going to be concerned is right after they're overhauled, and until they've got a couple of hundred hours under their belt, that's the time I'm going to be very concerned about an engine failure, because that's what the statistics clearly show is the high risk zones are when the engine is young and when the engine has been seriously taken apart by a mechanic. and that's when they tend to fall out of the sky.
Okay, and then a follow-up. Should vacuum pumps be replaced every 500 hours? I'm
a very strong believer, and I practice this on my own airplane, that vacuum pumps, first of all, need to have a backup system. In other words, you either have to have two pumps, or you have to have an electrically driven standby pump, or you have to have an electrically driven backup gyro, because vacuum pumps fail with the most intractable possible failure mode. They work absolutely perfectly right up until they decide not to, and then they fail, in a matter of milliseconds. They give you no warning. There is no way of doing any sort of inspection to anticipate a vacuum pump failure. I've seen the pumps fail at 5 hours, and I've seen them go to 1,500 hours, and you just never can tell. So my philosophy about vacuum pumps that I use on my own airplane and that we use on our managed maintenance airplanes that use vacuum-driven gyros is you have to have a backup, whether it's a backup pump or whether it's a backup gyro, and then you run the pumps to failure. Because once you have a backup, the failure of a pump becomes an acceptable failure, and so it doesn't make sense not to run them to failure. Incidentally, the recent vintage of vacuum pumps come out with these inspection ports or smart sticks, depending on the brand you use, that allow you to measure the length of the vanes, and they instruct that the pumps should be retired when the vane length gets down to 1/2 of its original dimension. Over the years, every time I've ever had a vacuum pump failure in my airplane, I always tear down the pump and I measure the vanes. And the number of vacuum failures that I've had in which the vanes measured 1/2 or less of their original dimension is precisely 0. In other words, if I was going through this monkey motion of inspecting the vanes and retiring the pumps when the vanes got to half their original dimension, I would have prevented precisely 0 failures. It's again, one of those appealing ideas, and it simply doesn't work. So I have a backup, and I run the pumps to failure.
All right, Gary asks, how often
Oh, and I carry a spare, too. because they always seem to fail when you're on a trip somewhere. And my airplane uses the big 400 series pumps because it has de-icing boots. So I just carry a spare so that I'm never waylaid if the pump fails. That I've got a spare that we can put on pretty quickly.
So if you carry a spare, then I guess the question is how often? What's a typical length of time you get out of a pump before it fails?
Well, that's the problem with vacuum pumps. There isn't a typical time, and that's sort of that's the fallacy in the idea of replacing them at 500 hours or replacing them when the vanes get down to some dimension. Having studied vacuum pumps for many decades and experienced lots and lots of failures over many years, I am convinced that the way vacuum pumps work is that periodically throughout their lives they shed little chips of graphite off of the vanes, and most of the time those little chips of graphite wind up going out the pressure port of the pump, and with no harm and no foul. And once in a great while, that little chip of graphite winds up in the wrong place at the wrong time, jams the vane, breaks the hub, shears the coupling, and the pump is dead. And it's about as close a thing from an aircraft standpoint as rolling dice as anything I've ever seen. It is just a completely random kind of thing, and you simply can't predict when vacuum pumps, dry vacuum pumps, are going to fail.
Okay, so Gary asks, how often do you recommend changing functioning, non-leaking brake lines?
Well, basically, I believe in doing them on condition. You inspect them at annual, and what we're really well, first of all, obviously, we're looking for any visible deterioration, but we also we want to flex them with our hands and feel if they're starting to get stiff. And if the hoses are starting to get stiff, then it's time to change them. And that's a kind of a classic on condition kind of thing.
Okay. So a comment here from Dan. He says he.
Oh, one other comment about hoses, by the way, not particularly brake hoses, but I'm a big believer in using Teflon hoses for flexible, flammable fluid carrying lines. The Teflon hoses basically, they're called lifetime hoses. They're not literally lifetime hoses, but they can routinely remain in service for 20 or 30 years without any problem. The only applications where and they cost maybe 15 or 20% more than rubber hoses, but they essentially eliminate the need for periodic hose replacement. The only applications where I would not recommend Teflon hoses are in applications where the hoses do a tremendous amount of flexing over a large angle, like, for example, hydraulic hoses in hydraulically actuated landing gears. It's probably not appropriate, but for fuel and oil hoses in most applications, I strongly recommend using the Teflon hoses. They cost a little bit more, but they last pretty much forever.
Okay, good tip. Dan makes a comment here. He says he just replaced a carb on his 0200. The cost of a new carb from the manufacturer, less the rebate for his old core, was about the same as a mid-range estimate from a certified rebuilder. So there are some instances where new is as good or better than inspect and repair, and the new part is certified and guaranteed.
Well, that's absolutely a legitimate comment. But I assure you, for example, that was not the case with the mufflers, and they don't take mufflers back for any kind of core value in exchange for a new muffler. The case that that he's talking about with the carburetor is a somewhat exceptional case. In most cases, when you purchase a new part, you don't get any core credit.
Gotcha. Okay, and comment from Richard. He says his annual is coming up next week, and just wondering if you have any tips for him. What should he be on the lookout for the shop that he brings his plane to?
Well, I mean that's hard to say. The time that I could offer him tips is when he gets the discrepancy list and cost estimate, because that's where all the interesting stuff happens. So I guess the main tip that I would give to him, and tip that I give every owner for every annual, is that when you put the airplane in the shop, make sure that you let the shop know that what you're authorizing them to do is open up the airplane, perform the inspection part of the inspection, prepare a discrepancy list with repair recommendations and cost estimates for each discrepancy, and then stop. That you are not authorizing them to purchase any replacement parts, and you're not authorizing them to perform any repairs until they give you the complete discrepancy list with cost estimates, and you have a chance to go through it and sit down with the IA and to discuss which items you want to approve and which items you want to decline. And then that's the time that when you get that discrepancy list, that's the time that all the interesting decisions get made. That's in my webinar on annuals. That's the point that I call the decision point. That when you have that discrepancy list and estimate in your hand, that's when you get to make all the interesting decisions about what you're going to approve and what you're going to decline.
Gotcha. Okay, so William makes a comment. He said on slide 30, you had indicated that overhaul of the propeller would take place at TBO on the engine. And William indicates that you said you have 200% pass TBO on your engine. What about your props? Could you comment on that?
Yes, my props were last overhauled 22 years ago. How's that for a comment?
That's a good comment. Yeah, 22 years
okay.
ago. So on repair, on condition.
I just had to do the math in my head real quick.
All right. So we had a comment here from Chris. He basically said it sounds like Alan should have asked some basic questions about cost before he left his aircraft in this particular shop.
Yes, actually, he should have asked more questions than that, because if he had done some due diligence, he would have found that this particular shop had a terrible reputation. In fact, its reputation was so bad that literally the week that Alan's airplane went into this shop, Cirrus revoked the shop's authorization as a factory authorized service center. But clearly, Alan did not do any due diligence before he decided to use this shop that he never used before. One of the rules that we have that we try to stick by is never to use a shop for an annual until we've tried them out on a couple of smaller things like oil changes or tire changes, and learn a little bit about how they work and so on. If you pick the wrong shop or mechanic to do an annual, things can get very, very painful and uncomfortable, as Alan's case shows. So it's really important to do careful due diligence before you entrust an annual to a shop and mechanic, and that's clearly something that Alan didn't do in this case.
Yeah, and Randy then follows up with a question. Wondering how much that your company charged for the extensive review and work to get that shop's estimate lowered and more of a reasonable price, if you'd care to comment on that.
Well, our managed maintenance program is a flat rate program, and for any single engine piston airplane like Alan's airplane, we charge a fixed fee of $750 a year. So he paid us $750 for this, and saved $17,000. Now, that's not our typical batting average. Let me be very clear on that. His case was quite exceptional, and the reason I chose it to discuss tonight is simply because it so clearly illustrates the issues involved. But generally speaking, we tend to save our clients many times as much money in reduced maintenance cost as what we charge them in a management fee. But it's a fixed fee, and for a piston single, it's $750.
Excellent. Yes. So a couple comments just for an outstanding and an excellent presentation by David and Charles. And Terry is wondering about magnetos. He says, is it mandatory that magnetos and alternators be IRAN every 500 hours?
It is not mandatory. We believe that it is very important to do it for magnetos, and we believe that it shouldn't be done for alternators. You know, there are a number of reasons for that, but magneto failures are much more serious than alternator failures. And alternators, in our experience, tend to have a high infant mortality rate, which means that replacing them increases the probability of failure. So for those reasons, we are pretty religious about doing 500-hour magneto IRANs, even though it is not required by regulation. And we tend to decline any action on alternators. We run them to failure.
Great. Okay, so George asks, what is the best way to determine if the annual inspection estimate for the inspection portion of the annual is fair and reasonable for a particular aircraft?
Well, there are most shops will have a schedule of flat rate inspection fees for various makes and models of aircraft, and so it would be worth getting quotes from a few different shops just to do a sanity check. As I said, on the Cirrus SR-22, the normal flat rate that we see shops charge, and we work with, there are 145 Cirrus service centers in the country, and we probably work with 125 of them. And the typical cost, flat rate cost for a Cirrus SR-22 is 24, 25 hours for a normally aspirated one like Allen's, or 30 hours for a turbo. This shop obviously was way, way high. So had we been involved in Allen's annual from the outset, which we weren't, we would have never approved the $3,600 flat rate quote right off the bat. But we weren't involved at that point, and Allen had agreed to it. And so we had to accept that as a given when we got involved.
Gotcha. And we're running up on 9:30, but I think what we should do is go a little bit late if you have time, since we started a little bit late. There are a few more questions that if you have time and are willing, we can keep going a little bit longer to cover the questions.
You bet.
Okay, so Jim asks, do a repair and an overhaul usually carry the same warranty?
No, typically repairs don't carry any warranty. Overhauls, it depends on what we're talking about. You know, obviously, engine overhauls always carry some sort of a warranty, and the amount of warranty varies pretty widely from one overhaul shop to another. Overhauls of, you know, things like instruments and so on typically carry a fairly short warranty, maybe a 6-month warranty. So it depends on the kinds of thing, but typically repairs do not have a warranty, and typically overhauls do have some sort of warranty, and depending on what sort of thing we're talking about.
Okay, great. And Sean makes a comment. He says, I have found that owner-assisted work has saved me thousands. Also, having a great mechanic that believes as you do helps control costs. What are your thoughts on owner-assist on all work?
Well, I'm a huge fan of owner-assisted annuals and owner-assisted maintenance. That's actually how I got involved in maintenance. I've been an aircraft owner for 45 years and really only got into the maintenance side of things about 20 years ago. And the way I got involved was doing an owner-assisted annual, never knowing where it was going to lead. To be honest with you. One of the things I've said many times is that I think every aircraft owner should go through the experience of an owner-assisted annual at least once in his career, because it is such an incredibly educational experience. Not only do you learn a tremendous amount about your aircraft, but you also learn a tremendous amount about the whole maintenance process and what life looks like from the other side of the toolbox. And it just becomes a lot easier to interface with mechanics and stuff when you the act of doing an owner-assisted annual pretty much means you're living in the shop for a week or so, and you just get to see what goes on and how mechanics deal with things, and it's really very, very helpful to have that knowledge when you're dealing with mechanics, even on non-owner assisted stuff. So I'm just a huge fan of owner assisted maintenance, and not necessarily as a means of saving money, but as a way to get so much more knowledgeable about maintenance and about your airplane.
Yeah, that's so true. I know when I owned my Cessna 140, I had the opportunity to do owner assist annuals with a really good A&P IA, and I learned so much about how the aircraft work and how systems of the aircraft work and what's underneath this particular access panel, and it really gives you as a pilot a much broader understanding of how your aircraft is actually working.
Right, and also it gives you much more confidence when something goes wrong. That the more you understand about how the airplane works, the more you can deal with it rationally, and the less fear you have. We see a lot of fear reactions in aircraft owners because the airplane is the black box, and when something goes wrong, they don't know how serious it is, and so on. And owner-assisted maintenance and learning, having the opportunity to take things apart and put them back together gives you a lot more confidence in the machine, and a much better judgment as to what to do when things stop working correctly.
Yes, great comment. And Jim has a question here. He says, when does it make sense to add an engine monitor on an older airplane? He's got a 1979 Piper Arrow.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't consider 1979 as an older airplane. My airplane is 1979. But that was the peak production year for piston GA in the United States. So that was a premium year for an airplane to be built. But I consider that that an engine monitor should be on every piston-powered engine. Whether the airplane is older or newer really makes no difference. The engines are the same and the needs are the same. There's a misconception that a lot of people have that engine monitors are something that are only needed on sophisticated, high-performance airplanes, and my view is the very opposite. That the less sophisticated the airplane, the more important it is to have really good engine instrumentation. If I lose a cylinder on my 12-cylinder twin, I fly to wherever I was going, and I sit there fretting about how much it's going to cost to repair. If you lose a cylinder on a a 6-cylinder single like a Bonanza, you're probably going to land at the nearest airport and change your underwear. And if you lose a cylinder on a 4-cylinder single, there's a pretty good chance you're going to wind up putting it down on a road. So I ask you, who needs the engine instrumentation more? I think the guy with the 4-cylinder single needs it the most.
Gotcha. Okay, can you recommend a magneto shop?
Sure. We use a number of different magneto shops. I think my personal favorite probably is Aircraft Magneto Service up in Seattle. We do quite a bit of magneto work at G&N Aircraft in Griffith, Indiana. And there are several other shops. If somebody wants to drop me an email, I'll be glad to give them a list of the shops that we recommend. But those are two that right off the top of my head are shops that we like quite a bit.
Okay, great. And Mike asks, what are your recommendations for turbocharger maintenance? He's got a TSIO 520C. Is TBO a concern on a hot running part like the turbocharger?
Well, it would be very unusual for a turbocharger to go all the way to engine TBO without having to be replaced. My own experience on my airplane, where I'm absolutely anal retentive about keeping TITs under control and so on, is that I typically get somewhere around 1,300 to 1,500 hours out of a turbocharger, and I've talked to the prime turbo overhaul shops, and they say in their experience, a typical lifetime on a turbo is around 1,000 hours. So generally speaking, you can plan on going through 2 turbos per engine TBO or something like that. It would be pretty unusual for the turbocharger to make it all the way to engine TBO. But turbo replacement is something that, again, we do strictly on condition, and there are things that we look for. But blades, it's the spectrum. Any leakage of exhaust gases at places on the turbocharger that aren't supposed to leak would be a cause for replacing the turbocharger. But it's something that I recommend doing on condition, not at a particular time.
Okay, great. And we're coming to the end of the questions here. Just a couple left. Walt is wondering, can the vanes be replaced without replacing the complete vacuum pump?
Well, they can in theory. I'm not sure exactly why you would do that, but sure, you can open up a vacuum pump and replace the vanes. I always carry a repair kit with me in the airplane. In addition to carrying a spare pump, I always carry a repair kit, which contains all of the graphite components, the hub and the vanes, and a shear coupling. And I frequently can repair a failed vacuum pump in the field by replacing them. But I don't do that prophylactically. I do it when the pump fails. And if
Gotcha.
sometimes the pump cavity is in reasonably good shape, and you can repair the pump just by dropping in a new hub and vanes. And sometimes the cavity is badly washboarded, in which case it's not a good candidate for that. And so I'll put an overhauled or a new pump on and send the washboarded pump back in as a core.
Okay. And Frank has an interesting question here. He says, based on your experience, are there items shops do not do but actually should be doing to save money down the road?
Sure. I mean, for example, we're very, very big on doing bore scope inspections, and we ask shops to do a thorough bore scope inspection of each cylinder at every annual inspection for us. Some of them include that as part of the standard annual. Most of them don't, and we're willing to pay them, an extra hour of labor or something to do that because we think it's extremely important. We always do oil. We put every airplane that we manage on a spectrographic oil analysis program. Again, most shops won't do that unless you specifically ask them to do it, and I'm sure I could think of some other things like that.
Good. And Dan asks, how many of your Savvy maintenance clients do owner-assisted maintenance, and how does that work with the managed maintenance?
Relatively few of them. We have a few that do, but to be honest with you, the typical demographic of a managed maintenance client is somebody who would like to turn over responsibility for the maintenance to an expert and not have to worry about the details himself. So most of our clients are not the sort of people that do owner-assisted maintenance. It's just sort of a it's nothing we do intentionally. It's just sort of self-selection.
Okay. And Ronald asks, if a shop does an airworthiness directive, background check for an annual, does another shop have to do the same research? If the same shop is used each year, I would anticipate they would not do the same research for ADs for years back beyond 1 year. I'm a new owner, and I do perform owner-assisted maintenance.
Well, the answer to that is that depending on how much research you have to do at an annual inspection has a lot to do with how well the guy who did the previous annual documented his research. I use for my own airplane and recommend the use of a service called ADLOG, ADLOG, which is basically a logbook system with a big 3-ring binder. But part of the service is that they send you not only notifications of what ADs apply to the airplane, but also hard copies of the AD that you file away in the book, and it makes research much easier because you basically have everything in hard copy right in the 3-ring binder. And at the other extreme, I've had a few cases where I was asked to do an annual inspection on an airplane where the maintenance records were so messed up that I actually had to spend more time fixing up the records and doing during the AD research and so on than I did actually doing the physical inspection of the aircraft. So the better job the IA does in terms of paperwork, the easier the job of the guy who does it the next year.
Yeah, that sounds very reasonable. And we're coming to an end here. Looks like the last is a comment from Lynn, and she just says, please emphasize that it is important to take your aircraft to a shop that knows your type of aircraft. If you're going
Absolutely.
to get good opinions on what things really need to be replaced. So I think that's a great
absolutely
comment.
true. And the more sophisticated the airplane, the more important that is. One phrase that I frequently use to sort of emphasize that is saying that when it comes to picking a mechanic to do an annual inspection, time and type is more important than total time. It doesn't really matter that much how experienced the mechanic is overall. What really matters is how much experience he has with your particular make and model, and that's particularly true for sophisticated airplanes. I'm thinking about Cessna 210s and stuff that have fairly complex systems, or the Twin I Fly is a very complicated airplane. It's very important, particularly for annual inspections, to find a guy that has a great deal of experience in make and model.
Yeah. Well, with that, looks like we had pretty good attendance tonight, Mike. It looks like I saw about 450 total people that that tuned in throughout the night. We still have 273 people tuned in at this point right now, so real good attendance tonight. Thank you so much for solving your computer issues and going through plan A, B, and C.
Unfortunately, I didn't solve them. But this computer that failed on me tonight is the one that has essentially my entire life on it. I can't pay my bills or do anything, so you know what I'm going to be spending the next few days doing.
Good luck. I hope you can get it all worked out, sir.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty gruesome, but at any rate, I'm glad I was able to figure out a way to get going tonight. The thing that rescued us is the fact that I subscribe to a service called Carbonite that does continuous backups to a remote backup server, and so I was able to log into Carbonite and find the webinar materials that I had prepared on this computer that died today, and I'm working off my little sub notebook right now.
Wow. Well, good job with that. Good job with that, especially doing that under pressure with a time crunch looming over you. Next month, what do we have here? Looks like December 5th, you're going to be talking about the post-maintenance test flight.
Yes, that'll be a very interesting session. It's going to be full of war stories about airplanes that fell out of the sky shortly after they came out of the shop. lots of interesting photos and stuff. So that'll be a good one.
The high infant mortality rate issue.
Well, and even more than that, the maintenance-induced failure issue.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for your time tonight. It was a great webinar, very informative. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, you bet.
And to all the attendees tonight, thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate your patience at the beginning with our slight delay. And everybody have a good night. We look forward to having you tune in to another future webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.